look at what I have here on the screen. That's like the final rendered product, but it's composed of 5 different images, or you can say texture maps. And the shader network in Blender is combining these flat maps together using these nodes, this graph editor. So we're combining what I'm going to show you, and then the final product looks real. And this is kind of the standard workflow to create anything that you
texture open.
Oh, sorry, hold on. Okay, so first off, just by painting on the model, and you can do this in ZBrush or you can do it in the texture paint area in Blender. This is just the texture map. And I believe I set mine to out of ZBrush in Photoshop. It says 1024 by 1024. So this is a 1K texture map. That's the number of pixels, the height and width, 124 pixels tall, 124 pixels wide. 2K is usually the standard. So when you hear the word K, it's just it starts with 1024, and 2K is a multiplier. So a 2K image is 2048 by 2048 pixels, and then you go up to 4K, which is 496, and then there's 8K images now, and it kind of reflects the power of the device that is being used to show the animation. So like a 4K TV, it's going to be able to show 4K textures and nice detail. 8K is not really that popular yet, but it's even more detail. So when people go out and they buy a TV set, a lot of times they want a 4K TV set.
In theory, couldn't you see a higher resolution by zooming in on it?
Well, with 8K, that's kind of where 8K is being used, where, yeah, you get into more detail as you get closer to the image, but it's still going to be 4K because that's the limit of that device. But yeah, in theory, you could, this also applies to cameras. So you can buy an 8K camera and an 8K video camera, let's say, take 8K images, and then you have more detail that you can split up into smaller 4K images. So you get more shots, you get more information that you can take advantage of. So yeah, in theory, you could utilize 8K and then zoom in closer and closer. Whereas if you zoom too far with 4K, eventually you're going to see the quality is going to diminish as you zoom into it. Yeah, for example, if I zoom into this Photoshop image, eventually everything breaks down into individual pixels. But if I stay at a ratio of 1:1 at that resolution, then that is good quality. So double the number of pixels, and then I can get closer to the image without it breaking down. But that's the texture map. So this map here is the texture map. This came out of ZBrush just by painting on top of it. And, when we paint in ZBrush, we're basically selecting any brush. Usually I use the standard brush, but we're turning off Z add, we're turning on RGB, and then we're just picking a color. And then you're just painting on that surface. So that's how this map is generated after you create your UVs. So that's the process. And when you use the export tool here in ZBrush, it generates this flat map based on where you painted. So I painted in all these little details. I think there's like a scar, this line is like a scar that I painted in. And that's what you get. It's spread out flat. But when you bring it into Blender, that particular texture map is being routed. So here is the that texture map. So the abbreviations that ZBrush creates usually identifies the map. So TM is texture map. So that's being brought in here now. I could go straight into color. So this is my shader in Blender that I created by clicking on the model and creating a new shader. So I could skip these two maps I have on top and go from color into color here, color of my texture straight in there. I don't want to close. Now I hit render again. So I basically bypass the two maps on top, and this is what it looks like. So this is with the texture map and the normal map and the displacement. Now I can take off, let me take off the normal map. And now I will re-render that again. So the normal map creates the illusion of a bumpy surface. And it still has the displacement map, so it still is getting distorted geometry. But then I'll take off the displacement map. So I go into the little wrench tool, and I go to displace here. This is a modifier, but I will just hit X to delete the modifier. So now it's just color is being added to the model. It's the one texture map from Zbrush connecting the color, and that's it. So now when I render this, I get this. So this is just flat. This is just with the texture map. So this right here is basically this map. That's it. So that is just adding the texture. That's the original texture I painted on a flat model. Now, if I go and look at these other maps, that's the texture map. So to add detail, I'm using a couple other maps. So I have a map called a cavity map. So that's CV. So you look at this map. So this came out of Zbrush, but this is where I'm in Zbrush using the sculpt tools to create wrinkles and veins and bumps and all these details. And that is basically all those details though for the cavity map. And the reason it's called a cavity, where I have bumps that I'm raising up or where I'm digging into the model, that's kind of where you have areas where like dirt can get into. So those cavities are going to be darker because you have dirt and dust and stuff that gets into the cavities. And this one is what this map represents. So you have this type of map where in little recesses, it just gets kind of filled in and gets a little dirty. That adds realism. And another type of map that's similar is called an ambient occlusion map. So that's identified with AO for ambient occlusion. It's not as detailed, but it still represents recesses. You kind of see here these darker 4 areas. Those are where the eyes are, the eye holes for the eyeball. So these recesses are based on how light is trying to get into these deeper areas. So the word ambient occlusion basically means the ambient light, the natural light is being occluded or it's being blocked because you have deeper parts of your model. And that's an ambient occlusion map. So the way this works in Blender is when you export these out of ZBrush, if you want to add these additional maps, this is what I had to do some like homework on, because by default, it doesn't bring in all the maps out of ZBrush into Blender. You have to basically rebuild the actual network, the shading network, using these nodes down here. So here, I'm going to switch this. I'm just turning off the wireframe shaded so you can see the model. And this is in the viewport here in Blender. So you can kind of see just the only thing you see here is this original texture map for the color. Now, these nodes up here, in one node I have cavity map. So that is represented with the abbreviation CV. And I have a ambient occlusion map. That's AO. So ambient occlusion is where light is not penetrating. So you have dark areas on a surface. Cavity map is where dirt and grime are collecting in the folds and the scrapes and the little recesses in an object. So to get this to work though, you're basically just combining your main color and your ambient occlusion and your cavity map. The main color map is color, so that's color information, but your ambient occlusion and your cavity is grayscale. So that's basically black and white. But what we do is we can take these mix nodes in Blender. So you can do a Shift A, you can do a search, and you search for mix, and it's mix RGB. And these mix nodes basically combine images together using a certain type of math. So if I go here under mix, I can change these. If you use Photoshop, these are like your blend modes in Photoshop. A multiply, which is down here, will take your grayscale. It will take the dark areas and consider that with a multiply node, your light areas, anything that's white would have the number 1, and anything that's grayscale would go from a 0 to a decimal value. So if you multiply color, and let's say you have white, the white basically doesn't affect anything, but your grayscale will make things darker. And you can do that with this multiply node. I already have one set up here, but I'll just do it again. So basically you take your color, you go into one of the colors here, and you find your ambient occlusion and drag it into color there. And then you have a factor, so that kind of mixes the two. So the greater the factor is, the greater the multiplier is. So right now it's at the 0.5. So basically all the white from the ambient occlusion will go away, and the darker grayscale values where you have the areas where the light's not going into will basically be more prominent. And then I can connect color from here to there. So I can play with this. If I lower it, kind of see, if I lower it, you kind of see it's more of the ambient occlusion. It goes like grayscale. If I raise it, you see more of the base color. So I put it at like 0.7. So basically you have more base color coming through, but and less of the ambient occlusion, but just enough. But now if I render this, you can start to see where it's getting dark in the eyes a little bit more and around the arms. It's adding a little bit of darkness. And basically I will here, let's see. Can take. So okay, I'm gonna for instance, if I raise this factor down to 0, that's all ambient occlusion, and there's no more color from the texture map. So now when I render, should look a little lighter. I don't see much change. Let me raise it up the other way. See, now you see there's a lot more color here because I raised it up. And then if I scale this factor back, there's less color, and you can see some of the ambient type details. So that's more for like recessed areas, like underneath the arms, inside the eye cavities. That's where the ambient occlusion comes in. And then with the cavity map over here, I add a, I use another of these mix nodes, and I just have it set to mix. Now let me clean this up a little bit. So I'm gonna get rid of this. So the way this works now is I basically have multiple nodes here. So now I'm going to take that cavity map. I'm going to have the color go into this node here. I haven't set the mix. I have my combination of color and ambient occlusion go into that. And then I have this mix node go into the color. And you can see it kind of change right away. So that mix node is now combining the cavity map, which is more dramatic in terms of the color. You can see it's a lot darker than the ambient occlusion map because there's so many wrinkles on this creature. Now when I render it, you start to see all these little wrinkles kind of show up. It's still flat, but it's starting to add a little bit more detail. If I go into this node here and raise it up, I have less of the cavity map. If I raise it lower, I have less color and more of the cavity map. So now when I raise it lower and you look at it, you can see a lot more of this detail. So this dark areas here really represents the recessed areas that would get dirty on something like this. But you can kind of see some bumps in the arms. It's kind of getting interesting. So next thing I'll do is I'll add a displacement so you can see that. So when you bring your model into ZBrush, it's going to look from ZBrush into Blender. It's going to look like this. It has the smoothing set, but it has big polygons because you exported it as a low resolution model. When I go into object mode, before I add this, and if I click back on shape flat, you can kind of see that. So this is the low resolution model. It's all faceted. So this is what you'll see when you bring it into Blender, when you export it out of ZBrush as an OBJ file. Now, when I click on this, the first thing I do is I smooth it, and that helps out a lot. And then I hit Control, usually 3 or 4, and that's going to add a subdivision, which appears in this Add Modifier area underneath the wrench, the properties. So the added displacement, what I do is go to Add Modifier, Displace, and then once you do that, it kind of makes everything really it pushes everything out. It adds this like default displacement, which pushes it out. I usually bring this mid-level down a little bit first, and then you can play with the strength. So the strength is adding to the amount that's being pushed out. Instead of 1, I can go down to 0.1, and that kind of brings me back to the original. You can see if I play with mid-level, that helps out a little bit. You don't want to push this level up too high because the fingers will lose definition. But there's like this kind of default displacement that's being set here. Now with this, you can hit New, and you can add a texture in here. And that texture is going to be the file that came out of ZBrush here with this exporter. And in Photoshop, it's this file. So it has the DM for displacement map. If I open that, this is what it looks like. So it's just kind of this grayscale, bumpy type file. Everything that you see is gray. It's like a 50% gray, and you have light areas, which are the height, represents height. You have black areas that kind of represent recesses there. So you see how the eyes are black. That's kind of gonna make the eyes more recessed. So I'm going to look for this map in Blender. It's called, it has this DM at the end. So in Blender, I'm going to go to this displace node, hit New. So a new texture is being added. I go into the texture node here. Actually, under New, what I can do is let's see. Got to make sure it's the right. Actually, I don't want to hit new. I want to, I'm going to undo. Actually, I can go into this little texture node here first and hit new. And then I can go to the folder, find my displacement map. I know it's the displacement because it says DM. Hit open. It adds it here, so I can kind of see it in there. Now I can go back into the little wrench tool. Under displace here, I can select that map. I got to just figure out PSD2. Yeah, let's see. Not sure which one it is here. So there it is there. So let's see something here. So I'm going to go here under UV. And I think, is it? I need to render this to look, just to look at it. No, it's not being applied. Oh, so I also have to under here, under coordinates, I have to hit UV. To make sure I have the UV map selected. And now it's applied. So yeah, I just have to, I had local set, I had to hit UV. Now it's pulling the, that texture that I brought in over here is now being applied to this place over here. So now when I render it, you can kind of see it's getting a little bumpy now. And then here, if I play with under displace, if I play with that strength, like if I raise it up to like 0.2, you can really start to see it. So it's usually a combination of playing with strength and this mid-level setting. Now you can see those bumps. So you can actually see the geometry is changing based on the grayscale map. And this is the actual sculpture detail coming out of Zbrush. So now when I do a render here, now you can really start to see it. So the final thing I usually add to this is this normal map. So the normal map is brought in as a texture and it goes into normal. But I also have to add a normal map node here. So this has color set, so I can drag the normal map, and the normal map looks like this in Photoshop. So it has this like rainbow type appearance to it. So I think Madeline, I noticed in ZBrush, you were kind of painting a texture. Well, you were kind of actually painting a normal map directly onto your model in ZBrush. And so the different colors here kind of represent different directions. And this gives the illusion of additional surface detail. So now if I go into Blender, and what you do is you bring the normal map in here, you click the folder, you find the texture that has the NM, that's ZBrush's way of labeling it. You open that up, you attach this to color, and then you attach this normal map to normal. And then that will add a little bit more detail to the model, but it's not changing the geometry. It's just giving the illusion based on the normals, which I talked about. They stick out. So this is kind of like manipulating those normals, because if you move your normals, you can give, if the normals are coming straight out, it's a hard edge. If you move them at a certain angle, it softens things up. So you're modifying the normals with this map. Now, if I look at it now, you won't see a huge difference. Actually, ooh, there is a pretty big difference. So this has a pretty big change. I think there's one last thing I have to change here on the normal map, and I can play with that strength. I think I have to bring it down. And I think that can stay the same. So that strength setting is going to affect it. So if I play with that strength here, where the normal map texture is coming in, I can affect that normal map on the model. So that's, I mean, that really is too much. So I'm going to bring it back down to point one. And the last thing that I did with this is I added some lights. So I have a bunch of lights coming from all directions. So these flat panels are area lights. The circles are point lights. The one that has circles and it radiates out is the sun. You add lights by hitting Shift A, going down to light, point, sun, area, and spotlights are your main ones. And then on the creature, I went into the texture and I just raised up subsurface a little bit, makes it more waxy, you know, a little shiny by raising up metallic and specular, playing with roughness. So just adjusting those can give it a more like skin-like appearance. So that's basically the combination of all these maps to get this final product out. So what you have to think about is what details you want to add to your model now. So there should be a stage where we start to add some details to this model. So does everybody have their model? Like if you're using Zbrush for Mini, just open it up in Zbrush for Mini. If you're using Zbrush, open up your model in Zbrush. So what I want to do is kind of go around and see what types of details you can start to add. And then I want you to actually create these maps and start to think about raising the quality of your characters. And just using these maps and going through this process is going to help raise the quality. So why don't you get Zbrush ready, have your models ready, and what we'll do is we'll take a little break, and then I'll go around to each of you, and let's look at your characters, and let's see how we can start to apply these maps. Because I want you to be able to do this on your own, where you have a nice quality character, so when we animate it, it starts to look real. I mean, in general, this is how we create high quality creatures for the movie industry and for video games. So yeah, let's take a little 10-minute break. When we come back at 10:05, have your models ready, and let's go through this process so you can kind of get more familiar with this process. Okay, so I'm going to see you in 10 minutes, and just be ready, and we'll go through person by person. And I'm going to